April 29th, 1945. Landsberg, Bavaria. The war had ended here 3 days early. Along the muddy shoulder of Highway 12, just south of the Lech River, a column of German prisoners sat cross-legged in the spring grass, their helmets removed, their rifles stacked in neat pyramids by American guards who looked barely old enough to shave. The air smelled of wet earth and diesel exhaust. Cherry blossoms drifted from the orchards beyond the roadblock, settling on the shoulders of men who had once marched beneath different banners. A staff sergeant from Iowa chewed gum and filled out paperwork on the hood of a Jeep. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled with swing music. Benny Goodman, perhaps, or Glenn Miller, the sound thin and strange against the silence of defeat. Then the children came. They arrived in clusters of 3 and 4. American kids between 8 and 14 years old, sons and daughters of the occupation engineers and logistics officers who had moved into requisitioned homes in the nearby town. They wore dungarees and cotton shirts, carried school books under their arms, and approached the prisoners with the casual curiosity of boys inspecting a circus that had arrived unannounced. One held a baseball, another had a fountain pen. A freckled girl in braids clutched a blank autograph book, the kind sold in 5 and dime stores across Kansas and Tennessee, its cover embossed with gold stars. The German soldiers stared, and then, quietly at first, they began to laugh. Not the bitter laughter of men broken by captivity, nor the manic hysteria of those who had lost their minds in the last days of the Reich's collapse. This was something else, laughter edged with disbelief, with a kind of stunned absurdity that comes when the world reveals itself to be so far removed from what you had been taught to expect that the only possible response is to surrender to the strangeness of it. A young panzer grenadier, no older than 20, with a bandage still wrapped around his forearm, accepted the pen from a 10-year-old boy and signed his name in careful script. Another soldier, a sergeant from the 6th SS Mountain Division, shook his head slowly and murmured something in German that the American lieutenant standing nearby could not quite hear. The girl with the braids held out her book. The prisoners signed it one by one, as if they were film stars, as if they had not spent the last 4 months retreating through frozen forests and burning villages, as if the world had not been divided by ideology and fire. The scene lasted less than 20 minutes. Then the trucks arrived, and the column moved on toward the processing camp at Moosburg. But the image remained, lodged in the memory of those who witnessed it. A strange, quiet moment that seemed to contain within it something essential about the nature of the conflict that had just ended, something about the distance between what the soldiers of the Third Reich had believed and what they encountered when they finally crossed into the custody of the nation they had been trained to despise. For 12 years, the children of Germany had been taught that America was a place of chaos and degeneracy, a mongrel nation without culture, without discipline, without soul. In the classrooms of the Reich, from the Baltic to the Bavarian Alps, instructors had presented the United States as a cautionary tale, a land where racial mixing had produced weakness, where Jewish financiers controlled the government, where the people were too soft, too individualistic, too obsessed with material comfort to ever produce soldiers capable of standing against the disciplined legions of the Aryan ideal. This was not fringe propaganda. It was curriculum. It was woven into geography lessons and history texts, into the songs sung at Hitler youth camps, and the speeches delivered at party rallies. America, the children learned, was a giant with clay feet, a nation that might possess wealth and resources but lacked the spiritual strength to wield them, a civilization already in decline, hollowed out by democracy and jazz and the corrosive influence of international Jewry. The soldiers who came of age in this system carried these lessons with them into combat. They had heard that American troops were poorly trained, that they relied on machinery rather than courage, that they would collapse under sustained pressure. There were anecdotes, repeated in barracks and trenches, about GIs surrendering en masse in North Africa, about entire units breaking under artillery fire in Italy. Some of this was wishful thinking. Some of it was based on early encounters in P3 1942 and 1943, when inexperienced American divisions had indeed stumbled against veteran German forces. But much of it was rooted in a deeper ideological conviction, a belief that the democratic experiment had produced a people incapable of true martial virtue, that the individualism celebrated in American culture was incompatible with the collective, required to win wars, and so, when the Wehrmacht and SS marched into battle, they carried with them not just rifles and field manuals, but a mythology, a narrative that assured them they were facing an inferior enemy, an army that would crumble once the reality of war imposed itself. By the spring of 1945, that mythology lay in ruins. The German prisoners who sat in the grass along Highway 12 had arrived at that moment through 100 different routes. Some had been captured in the Ruhr pocket, where more than 300,000 Wehrmacht soldiers had been encircled and forced to surrender in mid-April. Others had been taken in the final chaotic days of the Reich's collapse, when entire divisions dissolved into bands of stragglers trying to reach the American lines before the Soviets overtook them. A few had surrendered individually, walking into checkpoints with their hands raised, preferring captivity under the Western Allies to the alternative that awaited them in the East. They came from every branch of the German military: infantry, armor, engineers, logistics, and from every corner of the crumbling empire. Some had fought since 1939. Others had been drafted in the desperate final levies of 1944, boys and old men pulled into a war that had already been lost. What they shared, regardless of their individual histories, was the experience of crossing a threshold. They had passed from the world they knew, the world of the Third Reich, with its certainties and hierarchies and iron discipline, into something they had not been prepared for. And that something was America. Not America in the abstract. Not the America of propaganda posters or newsreels, but America as it actually existed, embodied in the soldiers and civilians they now encountered. The contrast was immediate and profound. They had expected cruelty. They received cigarettes. They had expected brutality. They received boredom. They had expected the fury of victors. They received the casual indifference of men who wanted only to finish the job and go home. And then came the children, asking for autographs. The laughter that spread through the column that April afternoon was not universal. Some prisoners remained silent, their faces set in expressions of sullen defeat or exhausted apathy. Some wept. Others stared at the ground, refusing to acknowledge the children or the guards or the reality of their situation. But among those who did laugh, there was a common thread, a recognition, perhaps, of the absurdity of the gulf between expectation and experience, a dawning awareness that everything they had been told was not merely incorrect, but grotesquely, almost comically wrong. This was not supposed to be how it ended. In the mythology they had absorbed, capture by the Americans was meant to be a grim affair, a descent into a system as harsh and pitiless as any operated by the Reich itself. They had been warned of reprisals, of summary executions, of camps where prisoners were starved and worked to death in retaliation for German atrocities. Some of this fear was genuine. The soldiers knew what their own forces had done in the occupied territories, knew the scale of the crimes committed in the name of the Führer, and they assumed the Allies would respond in kind. But much of it was also ideological conditioning, a projection of the Reich's own brutality onto the enemy, an inability to imagine that a nation built on different principles might operate according to different rules. The reality was more complex, of course. American captivity was not a paradise. Conditions in the hastily erected POW camps varied widely, and in the chaotic final weeks of the war, supply lines were strained and resources scarce. Prisoners were often held in open-air enclosures with inadequate shelter, and rations could be meager. There were abuses. The phenomenon of American children seeking autographs from German POWs was not isolated to that single afternoon in Bavaria. It occurred in dozens of locations across the occupied zones, a strange recurring motif in the final months of the European war and the early years of the occupation. In some cases, the children were the sons and daughters of American military personnel stationed in Germany. In others, they were young Germans themselves, approaching the prisoners out of curiosity or familial connection. The interactions varied in tone and context, but the underlying dynamic remained consistent. A collision between the martial gravity of the prisoner's recent past and the innocent, almost frivolous normalcy represented by the children. For the German soldiers, the request for an autograph was destabilizing in ways that more overtly significant events were not. A soldier can comprehend capture. He can adjust to imprisonment, to labor, even to interrogation. These are experiences that fit within the framework of war, harsh but intelligible. But to be asked for an autograph, to be treated not as a defeated enemy but as a figure of interest, even admiration, by children who seemed utterly unconcerned with the ideological stakes of the conflict, this was something else. It suggested a world in which the war was already becoming history, in which the prisoners themselves were relics, curiosities from a conflict that the children perceived as distant and abstract, something to be catalogued and remembered, but not feared. There was a cognitive dissonance embedded in the act. The prisoners had spent years operating within a system that told them they were heroes, warriors in a cosmic struggle to preserve European civilization from annihilation. They had marched through Poland and France, through Russia and the Balkans, convinced that their cause was righteous, that their sacrifices were necessary, that history would vindicate them. And now, sitting in the mud with their helmets off and their weapons gone, they were being asked to sign autograph books for children who seemed to regard them with the same idle curiosity they might reserve for a visiting athlete or entertainer. Chat-to-trace. Laughter, then, was a kind of psychological release, a momentary acknowledgement of the collapse not just of the Reich, but of the entire narrative structure that had given their actions meaning. It was the sound of men confronting the fact that the world they had believed in no longer existed, that the enemy they had been taught to despise was offering them cigarettes and chewing gum, that the war they had fought with such ferocity had ended not in a final apocalyptic battle, but in a series of quiet surrenders and administrative procedures. And in that laughter, there was the beginning of something else, a crack in the ideological armor, a faint recognition that perhaps, just perhaps, they had been lied to. The American abundance that greeted German prisoners was not merely material, but conceptual. It was not just that the GIs had more food, more equipment, more vehicles, though they did, in quantities that defied the imagination of soldiers accustomed to scrounging for supplies in the final months of the Reich. It was that the Americans seemed to carry this abundance casually, almost carelessly, as if it were a natural state of affairs rather than an achievement requiring discipline and sacrifice. The prisoners observed this in 1,000 small details. The way American soldiers discarded half-smoked cigarettes, the way they threw away rations they found unpalatable, the way they spoke to their officers without the rigid formality that governed German military culture, the way they seemed, even in the midst of occupation duty, to be thinking about home, about baseball games and county fairs and the lives they would return to once the war was over. This was difficult to reconcile with the image of America they had been fed. The propaganda had prepared them for a nation that was rich but weak, materially prosperous but spiritually bankrupt. What they encountered instead was a society that seemed to have integrated its material abundance into a functioning social order, that had managed to mobilize for total war without abandoning the democratic institutions and cultural habits that defined it. The American soldiers were not supermen. They were often undisciplined by German standards, prone to complaining, more interested in getting the job done efficiently than in displays of martial zeal. But they were also effective, resourceful, and backed by a logistical system that could deliver ice cream to frontline troops and construct entire airfields in a matter of weeks. The prisoners noticed the vehicles first. The endless columns of trucks and jeeps and half-tracks, the supply convoys that stretched for miles, the casual profusion of machinery that suggested a productive capacity beyond anything the Reich had achieved even at the height of its power. German soldiers who had spent years watching their own supply lines dwindle, who had seen entire divisions reduced to foot travel and horse-drawn wagons, were staggered by the sheer scale of American mechanization. One prisoner, a lieutenant from a panzer division, later recalled standing by the roadside as an American convoy passed, counting vehicles for over an hour until he lost track, and realizing with a kind of sick clarity that the war had never been winnable, that the Reich had been attempting to fight an industrial power that operated on a different order of magnitude. But the abundance was not only mechanical, it was also edible. Food became the recurring symbol, the tangible proof of American capacity that prisoners could taste and touch and carry with them. The rations distributed in the POW camps were not luxurious by American standards, but to men who had spent months on short rations, who had witnessed the collapse of the German food distribution system in the final winter of the war, they seemed almost incomprehensibly generous. There was meat. There was white bread. There was coffee. Real coffee. Not the ersatz grain mixtures that had become standard in the Reich. There were canned vegetables and fruit, chocolate bars, condensed milk, and there was the casual waste, the sight of American soldiers tossing aside food that would have been hoarded and cherished by their Wehrmacht counterparts. One prisoner, a corporal from a Volksgrenadier division, later wrote in his memoirs about the first meal he received in American custody. It was a stew, served in a metal bowl, accompanied by bread and butter. The bread was soft, almost fluffy, a texture he had not experienced in years. The butter was real, not margarine. The stew contained chunks of beef. He ate slowly, trying to make it last, and when he finished, he was handed a second portion. He assumed there had been a mistake, that the guard had miscounted, but when he tried to refuse, the guard simply shrugged and walked away. There was enough for seconds. There was enough for everyone to have seconds. The realization hit him with physical force. This was not a scarce resource being carefully rationed. This was surplus. The American Red Cross parcels added another layer of surreality. Prisoners received packages containing cigarettes, candy, soap, playing cards, and other small luxuries. Some packages included instant coffee, canned meat, and powdered milk. The German soldiers examined these items with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. How could a nation at war, a nation that had mobilized millions of men and transported them across an ocean, still have the capacity to produce and distribute luxury goods to enemy prisoners? It violated the logic of total war as they understood it. In the Reich, total war had meant sacrificing everything for the front, stripping the civilian economy to the bone, demanding austerity and endurance. The prisoners carried the memory of this scarcity with them into captivity. They had seen their comrades scavenge for food in the ruins of French villages, had watched horses slaughtered for meat when supply trains failed to arrive, had learned to distinguish between the sound of friendly and enemy aircraft because the latter meant another disruption to the already tenuous logistics network. They had lived through the disintegration of the Reich not as a sudden catastrophic event, but as a slow grinding down, a gradual erosion of the systems and certainties that had sustained them. And now they sat in American custody, eating white bread and receiving Red Cross parcels, and the contrast was so stark it bordered on the hallucinatory. Some prisoners rationalized this. They told themselves that America had not been bombed, that its factories and farms remained intact, that the Atlantic Ocean had shielded it from the devastations that had consumed Europe. This was true, but it was not the whole truth. Other nations had escaped bombing and still could not match American productivity. The deeper issue was not geography, but organization, not resources, but systems. The United States had built an economy capable of producing both guns and butter, of maintaining civilian living standards while simultaneously outproducing every other nation on Earth in military hardware. It had done so not through slave labor or conquest, but through a combination of technological innovation, efficient management, and a political system that, for all its flaws and contradictions, had proven capable of mobilizing a diverse population toward a common goal. This was the lesson embedded in the autograph books and the chewing gum, in the casual generosity of soldiers who handed out cigarettes, and the logistical infrastructure that ensured prisoners received medical care and adequate rations. It was a lesson about the capacity of democratic societies to sustain themselves under pressure, to wage war without becoming consumed by it, to retain a sense of normalcy and humanity even in the midst of total conflict. For the German prisoners, this lesson was difficult to absorb. It challenged everything they had been taught, everything they had believed about the superiority of authoritarian discipline and the weakness of liberal democracy. But it was also undeniable. The evidence was all around them, tangible and inescapable. And so they laughed, because laughter was easier than confronting the full implications of what they were experiencing. There were, of course, prisoners who did not laugh, who refused to accept the implications of their situation. Some remained committed Nazis, true believers who interpreted their capture not as evidence of the Reich's failure, but as a temporary setback in a struggle that would eventually be vindicated by history. They clung to rumors of secret weapons, of underground resistance movements, of a final reckoning that would restore the Reich to its rightful place. These men were a minority, but they were not insignificant. They organized within the camps, maintaining internal discipline, punishing perceived collaborators, keeping alive the ideology that had brought them to this point. For them, the kindness of the Americans was not a revelation, but a deception, a facade concealing the true intentions of the Jewish-controlled enemy. Others fell into despair. They had lost the war, lost their comrades, lost the future they had been promised. Some had learned that their homes had been destroyed in the bombing campaigns, that their families were dead or displaced. The collapse of the Reich was not merely a political or military event for these men. It was personal, a shattering of the structures that had given their lives meaning. The abundance of the Americans, the casual normalcy of the children asking for autographs, only deepened their sense of dislocation. They had sacrificed everything for a cause that had failed, and now they were expected to accept food and cigarettes from the victors, to participate in a system of captivity that treated them not as villains, but as defeated soldiers, men who had simply backed the wrong horse. But for many, perhaps most, the experience of American captivity initiated a slow, often reluctant process of reevaluation. It began with small observations, with the accumulation of details that did not fit the narrative they had been taught. The Americans were not monsters. They were, in fact, often quite ordinary, tired, homesick, eager to avoid unnecessary trouble. They complained about their officers, grumbled about the food, talked endlessly about baseball and movies and the girls they had left behind. They lacked the ideological fervor that had characterized the Wehrmacht, the sense of serving a higher cause. But they also lacked the cruelty that such fervor often produced. They enforced the rules of captivity with a bureaucratic efficiency that seemed almost absurd in its lack of drama. Prisoners were counted, fed, assigned to work details, and left, largely to their own devices. There were no executions, no torture, no systematic brutality. There were only forms to fill out, regulations to follow, and a general atmosphere of weary professionalism. And slowly, through the accumulation of these mundane interactions, some prisoners began to question the ideology that had brought them to this point. If the Americans were not the weak, degenerate enemy they had been promised, then what else had they been lied to about? If the democratic system could produce not just wealth, but also discipline and effectiveness, then what was the justification for the authoritarian model the Reich had embraced? If the treatment they received as prisoners was marked by a basic respect for human dignity, then what did that say about the treatment the Reich had meted out to its own prisoners, to the civilians in the occupied territories, to the millions who had been categorized as subhuman and exterminated? These were not questions that could be answered easily or quickly. For most prisoners, the process of confronting their complicity in the Reich's crimes would take years, if it happened at all. Many would return to Germany and reconstruct lives without ever fully reckoning with what they had participated in. But the seeds of doubt were planted in those early days of captivity, in the moments when expectation collided with reality, when the mythology they had absorbed proved inadequate to explain the world as it actually was, and for some, that collision began with laughter. On a spring afternoon in Bavaria, when American children asked for their autographs. The symbolic weight of the autograph book is difficult to overstate. In a single object, it contained the essence of the cultural and ideological divide that separated the prisoners from their captors. The autograph book was a product of American consumer culture, a trivial item mass-produced for children, a token of a society that had the leisure and resources to indulge in such frivolities even while engaged in a global war. But it was also an artifact of a culture that valued individual identity, that celebrated personal achievement and fame, that saw even ordinary people as worthy of commemoration. In the Third Reich, individual identity had been subsumed into the collective, into the Volk, into the state. The cult of the Führer had elevated one man to godlike status while reducing everyone else to interchangeable components of the racial community. But in America, even children carried books to collect the signatures of people they found interesting, as if everyone had a story worth remembering, as if individual lives mattered independent of their service to the state. When the prisoners signed those books, they were participating, however unwittingly, in a ritual of individualism, affirming their own identities as distinct persons rather than anonymous cogs in a military machine. For some, this was a small, almost meaningless gesture, a way to pass the time and humor the children. But for others, it was a quiet act of reclamation, a recognition that they were still human beings with names and stories, that their existence could not be entirely reduced to their service to a failed regime. The children, for their part, were oblivious to the symbolic weight of their request. They wanted autographs because they were curious, because the prisoners were exotic, because collecting signatures was something children did. They had no sense of the trauma the prisoners carried, no understanding of the ideological chasm that separated their worldviews. They approached the prisoners with the casual confidence of American kids who had been taught that the world was a place to be explored, that interesting things were worth investigating, that there was no harm in asking. And in that casual confidence, there was a power that the prisoners could not quite name. It was the power of a society that had raised children to feel safe, to feel entitled to curiosity, to feel that the world was fundamentally a place of opportunity rather than danger. The prisoners had come from a society that had raised its children to be soldiers, to sacrifice themselves for the Volk, to accept discipline and hierarchy and the inevitability of struggle. The contrast was total. As the weeks turned to months and the occupation solidified, the interactions between prisoners and Americans became routine. Work details were organized. Prisoners repaired roads, cleared rubble, worked in fields and factories under American supervision. The intensity of those first days, the shock of capture and the disorientation of encountering the enemy as actual people, faded into the rhythms of captivity. But the memory of those early encounters remained, a touchstone that prisoners returned to when trying to make sense of their experiences. In letters home, in diaries kept secretly in the camps, in conversations whispered after lights out, prisoners tried to articulate what they had witnessed. Some focused on the material abundance, the endless supply of goods that seemed to flow from America like water from an inexhaustible spring. Others wrote about the behavior of the guards, the strange mixture of informality and efficiency that characterized American military culture. A few attempted to grapple with the deeper questions, the implications of having fought for a cause that now seemed not just defeated, but fundamentally misguided. One prisoner, a former school teacher conscripted in 1943, wrote in his diary about watching a group of American soldiers play baseball during a break in their duties. He had never seen the game before, and he struggled to understand the rules. But what struck him was the joy the soldiers took in it, the way they laughed and shouted and argued over calls, the way the game seemed to exist in a space entirely separate from the war. In the Wehrmacht, recreation had been organized, purposeful, designed to build camaraderie and maintain discipline. But this was something else, spontaneous, chaotic, apparently pointless, and yet clearly meaningful to the participants. It was a glimpse into a culture that valued play for its own sake, that saw leisure not as a tool for ideological reinforcement, but as an end in itself. He did not write about this in ideological terms. He did not conclude that democracy was superior to fascism or that the Reich had been wrong. But he recorded the observation, and in doing so, he preserved a moment of recognition, a sense that there was something in the American way of life that the propaganda had not accounted for, something that resisted easy categorization or dismissal. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe had ended, and the focus of the American military shifted to occupation, demobilization, and the reconstruction of the shattered continent. The prisoner of war camps became semi-permanent installations, housing hundreds of thousands of German soldiers awaiting repatriation. The conditions varied, but the basic structure remained consistent: registration, labor, education. The American authorities implemented a denazification program, attempting to identify and remove committed Nazis from positions of influence while re-educating the broader population in democratic principles. The effort was ambitious, uneven, and ultimately limited in its effectiveness, but it represented a genuine attempt to transform the political culture of the defeated nation. For the prisoners, the denazification programs were often met with skepticism or resentment. Many saw them as victor's justice, a superficial effort to assign blame and extract confessions. But the programs also exposed prisoners to ideas and information that had been suppressed under the Reich. They watched films documenting the liberation of the concentration camps. They attended lectures on democratic governance. They read newspapers from the Allied nations, encountering perspectives that contradicted everything they had been taught. Some dismissed this as propaganda. Others began, slowly and reluctantly, to confront the reality of what the Reich had done. The process was not dramatic. There were no mass conversions, no sudden moments of collective enlightenment, but there were incremental shifts, small changes in perspective that accumulated over time. A prisoner who had dismissed the concentration camp footage as fabricated might later admit, in a quiet conversation with a fellow captive, that perhaps some of it was true. A soldier who had blamed Germany's defeat on betrayal by the home front might come to recognize that the Reich's strategy had been fundamentally flawed, that the leadership had led the nation into a war it could not win. A true believer who had clung to Nazi ideology might find, as the months passed and no rescue came, that his faith was not as unshakable as he had believed. These were not universal experiences. Many prisoners returned to Germany and reconstructed their lives without ever fully engaging with the questions raised by their captivity. But for a significant number, the encounter with America, whether through the abundance of the rations, the informality of the guards, or the absurdity of children asking for autographs, planted seeds of doubt that would take years to fully germinate. The children who collected those autographs likely forgot about them quickly. The books were tucked into drawers, buried under schoolwork and comics, and the accumulating debris of childhood. A few might have kept them, showing them to friends or family, using them as conversation pieces. But for most, the signatures of German prisoners were just another curiosity, a minor souvenir from the strange years when their parents were stationed overseas, when the world was in upheaval and history was being made in real time. But for the prisoners who signed those books, the moment carried a weight that endured. It was a small thing, almost trivial, but it captured something essential about the gulf between the world they had known and the world they had encountered in defeat. It was a reminder that the enemy they had been taught to despise was not a monolith, but a collection of individuals, that the nation they had been told was weak and degenerate had proven itself capable of winning the war, and doing so without abandoning its fundamental character. Years later, some of those prisoners would tell the story to their children and grandchildren, would recall the spring afternoon when American kids asked for their autographs, and they laughed in disbelief. And in the telling, the story would become a kind of parable, a way of explaining the incomprehensibility of those years, the distance between expectation and reality, the collapse of certainty. Because that is what the laughter was, in the end. It was the sound of certainty shattering, of ideology confronting its own inadequacy, of men realizing that the world was stranger and more complex than they had been prepared for. There is a tendency, in retrospective accounts of the Second World War, to view the conflict in stark binary terms: good versus evil, democracy versus tyranny, civilization versus barbarism. These frameworks are not wrong, but they are incomplete. They capture the moral stakes of the war, the fundamental choice between systems that respect human dignity and systems that deny it, but they obscure the human texture of the conflict, the ways in which individual soldiers on both sides were shaped by their cultures, their educations, their ideologies, and their experiences. The German prisoners who sat in the grass along Highway 12 were not monsters. They were men who had been taught a set of beliefs, had acted on those beliefs, and had been confronted with the consequences. Some of them had committed atrocities. Some had participated in the machinery of genocide. Some had simply fought as soldiers, following orders, trying to survive. The moral accounting for their actions is complex and cannot be resolved by easy generalizations. But what is clear is that their encounter with America, in the months and years following their capture, initiated a process of reckoning, a confrontation, with the gap between the world they had believed in and the world as it actually was. The abundance they witnessed, the food, the machinery, the casual confidence of the American soldiers and civilians was not merely a material fact. It was a manifestation of a different way of organizing society, a demonstration that democratic capitalism, for all its flaws and contradictions, was capable of producing not just wealth, but also resilience, not just power, but also a certain kind of freedom. The prisoners had been taught that such a system was inherently weak, that it would collapse under the pressures of total war. But the evidence before their eyes told a different story. And the children, with their autograph books and their innocent curiosity, embodied the strangeness of this new reality. They were the products of a society that had managed to wage a global war without militarizing its youth, without stripping away the normalcy of childhood, without demanding total sacrifice from its population. They were a reminder that there were different ways of organizing collective life, different answers to the question of what a society owed its members and what it could demand in return. The laughter that echoed along Highway 12 on that April afternoon was brief, a momentary release of tension and disbelief. But it resonated far beyond that single moment, carrying within it the seeds of transformation, the first glimmers of recognition, that the ideology they had served was not merely defeated, but wrong, that the enemy they had fought was not the monster they had imagined, but something more complicated and more human. In the decades that followed, the Federal Republic of Germany would rebuild itself as a democratic state, integrating into the Western Alliance and embracing the principles of liberal democracy. The process was messy and incomplete, marked by evasions and silences, by a reluctance to fully confront the crimes of the Nazi era. But it was also real. The Germany that emerged from the ashes of the Third Reich was a fundamentally different society, one that rejected the ideologies of racial supremacy and authoritarian rule, one that built institutions designed to prevent a recurrence of the horrors that had consumed Europe. That transformation did not begin with a single moment, and it cannot be attributed to any one cause, but it was made possible in part by the small, quiet encounters that took place in the months and years after the war, by the German soldiers who received rations from American guards, who worked alongside American supervisors, who watched American soldiers play baseball, who signed autograph books for American children. These encounters did not erase the crimes of the past, but they opened a space for something new, a recognition that the future did not have to replicate the patterns of the past, that there were other ways of living and other values worth embracing. Epilogue: freedom, it turns out, is not an abstraction. It is not a slogan or a doctrine or a set of principles inscribed in founding documents. It is a lived reality, manifest in the small, everyday choices that a society makes about how to treat its members, how to organize its economy, how to raise its children. It is visible in the soldier who hands a cigarette to a prisoner, in the logistical system that delivers ice cream to frontline troops, in the child who approaches a defeated enemy with a pen and a smile, asking for an autograph. The German soldiers, who laughed that April afternoon, were not laughing at a joke. They were laughing at the collapse of the world they had known, at the dissonance between what they had been taught and what they had found. And in that laughter, there was the first faint echo of understanding, the recognition that the nation they had despised, the enemy they had fought, had proven itself not through propaganda or coercion, but through the simple, undeniable reality of its existence. The autograph books are gone now, lost to time and the indifference of history, but the moment they represent endures. A reminder that even in the midst of the most terrible conflicts, there are spaces where humanity reasserts itself, where the certainties of ideology give way to the complexities of lived experience, where laughter becomes a form of truth-telling. And in that laughter, there is hope, not for redemption, which cannot be granted cheaply, but for the possibility of transformation, for the slow, difficult work of building a world less cruel than the one that came before.